Happy Friday. This is our 18th Friday happy hour. Stuart, can you take it away?
Again, Stuart here from San Francisco, welcoming everyone to Friday Happy Hour, Saturday morning for some of you guys. Thanks for showing up from Tokyo in Japan. We are here with, I think Sophie just said maybe the 18th one. Is that what you said, Sophie?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, congratulations. That's awesome. And so it's an opportunity to meet friends, make friends all over the world, get a chance to network. We have the presentation component as a part of this, and so we get an opportunity to learn something new also, which is awesome. And we get to support businesses around the world. Our sponsor is Miss Sophie Sorimachi of Anesian.com, which is an online tutoring company. So keep her in mind when you're talking to families. She works with children 8 to 18, all studies, and specializes in foreign languages. Again, that's Anesian.com. And I think that Sophie is going to introduce Mr. Gilbert Payne.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Stuart, for your great promotion. Thank you so much. And for tonight, we will have a wonderful sake sommelier, Gil Payne. He's a co-founder of Nombe, which is the sake izakaya, and in the top 100 of San Francisco restaurants, it's rated like that. So it's quite famous. And Gil himself is a sake sommelier, and he got this license certification by going back and forth to Japan and the US and learning both Japanese and English. Okay, and then he does restaurant consultation, and then also he gives advice for drink matters for restaurants, and then who wants to learn sake more. All right, Gil. Yes.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for the introduction. Nice to see you, Stuart. Mari-san, nice hat, and don't let it fly off into the tracks of Yokohama Station while you're there. A little bit about this talk and where it comes from a little bit. I've always found there's a lot of mystery for people when it came to sake, and I'm no different than that. The first time I had sake, I was spoiled because it was at an event where I was served kubota manju, which is the highest level of kubota sake, and at the time was kind of considered the Montrachet of sake, so to speak, the highest level, most acclaimed, and at that time the richest sake brewery. So I like to tell the story that when I met my future father-in-law, I was coming into a room that should have been labeled 25 of your future Japanese relatives and Gil, because there was one chair next to where he was seated on the dais, and then the rest of my future family seated in a square around the room. So I was immediately daunted. I kind of had a panic attack, and relaxed a little bit when I saw this gigantic Isho bean bottle of Kubota Manju on the table right next to us. So I remembered that it was a really good lunch. Everyone seemed okay with me being in the family, so I was pretty excited. But the next day at dinner for just the 4 of us or 5 of us was the Kubota Senju, the lowest level from the Kubota brewery. So I kind of asked my future father-in-law, I said, did yesterday go badly or something? Like, did I get demoted? He's like, no, yes, you did very well yesterday, but yesterday was special. That's why we had the manju. Now you're more of a part of the family. This is everyday drinking. So that kind of broke some of my myths about sake and the mystery that surrounded it for me, to understand that it wasn't just something special, that it was an everyday kind of drink that should be enjoyed. And as I got to know more about the culture from an everyday standpoint, I found how important sake was. So this talk just kind of talks a little bit about sake and how it kind of changed in the US. So as a little background, and I'll kind of go through these quickly, and I really like some interaction, so I'll stop at different times and ask you to join in. And I guess I'll start by saying kanpai to everyone. You can't see, or maybe you can see the bottle. This is a Dasai Junmai Ginjo. This is one of my favorite go-to sakes for day-to-day enjoyment, something that I keep in the refrigerator from time to time. So wherever you are, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, so kanpai, happy hour to everyone. So I'll go over how to actually taste a little later, but just a little background. Sake has really grown in popularity in the US, particularly as Japanese food became a little more commonplace. So I first was introduced to sake in the early 80s. I grew up out here in Oceanside, California, finished high school down south in San Jose. So some of the first experiences I had with sake was going to Japanese food places as a teenager and a college student, and having sake there. So unfortunately, I came with the same attitude that I think most Americans come to about sake, and that it was this liquid that was kept in a warmer that was next to the cooler that had the sake fish in it, and it was always going to be poured into a white carafe with the press of a button, and that white carafe and 2 little white ochoko would be handed to you, and that was essentially sake. Unfortunately, that kind of limited distribution of really premium sake outside of Japan really prohibited the exposure of people to higher levels of sake. So most of what we grew up, understanding as what sake was that warm stuff coming out of a coffee warmer at a sushi bar. So that's why I looked to try to change some of people's attitudes and break myths about sake. So the first sake myth I like to bust is the idea that sake is to be served warm. My experience as a sake person has been that heat is usually there to help mask an older sake or an inferior brew. And I call this, to some extent for Americans, the Berkeley factor. You may think that all of the biggest sake breweries are in Japan, but in fact, one of, by production, the largest sake breweries in the world is right across the bay. I can probably see it from my window. It's in Berkeley, right off the freeway, and that's where the Shochikubai factory has been since, I believe, the mid-'70s. They've given tours at it. It's been a kind of big part of Berkeley culture for a long time. But the fact is, they typically are sending futsushu out. Very simple sake that has had a very low milling rate, that is not premium sake to enjoy for drinking. It's a lot of times what in olden days people would use for cooking. So I always tell people, look at what the brewer intends. What is their intention? You can see that in terms of how the sake is shipped and how it's served to you. Most of the time in a restaurant serving premium sake, they'll present the bottle to you just like a wine bottle, and it's usually cold. That's because most sake is intended by the brewer to be enjoyed cold or at its warmest at room temperature. So when it starts from the brewer's brewery, from his property, it's usually either in a very cold sunken cave or other type of storage facility that may be either naturally or also with refrigeration kept cold. Then it gets on a refrigerated truck down to the port, onto a refrigerated container on a ship. When it hits Oakland or Long Beach or New Jersey or Baltimore, it comes off the ship, it gets onto a refrigerated truck, goes to one of the warehouses where the Japanese trading companies keep them cold, and then eventually it gets to my restaurant on another refrigerated truck and put right into my refrigerator. The whole time keeping the temperature consistent and keeping the intent of the brewer there. And that's really, really important. But unfortunately, we've had the influence of the thousands of sushi bars across the country, some of which unfortunately or fortunately may not be owned by someone that cares a lot about about sake, or may not have a lot of knowledge about it. And that leads to why I brought this up. And that's what I call Sake 101. Just to give people who serve sake a little appreciation more about what is involved with it and why they should handle it a certain way and why they should look to promote it to their diners in pairing ideas or promoting certain types of sakes that are better to enjoy by themselves. Just as at a wine bar, your server or the owner may suggest having certain types of wine with certain dishes, or there are certain wines that would be great to have just on their own without a food accompaniment. So really brief, sake is really one of the basic alcohols because you only have a few basic ingredients: rice, water, yeast or kobo, and koji. Koji, as most of you know, is say a fermented rice starter. For those of us who've been stuck here in COVID and trying every recipe we can find from the New York Times cooking website, think of this as like a akin to a sourdough starter. When you have fermented materials, you start with something that is actually going to turbocharge the process of making more, of propagating that bacteria into a larger amount of stuff, so to speak. Same way that you would make yogurt, same way you make sourdough starter. In this case, you're using koji, and then at 3 different times, through what we call sandan shikomi, you're adding more amounts of rice to build up a larger vat or brew, from which you will eventually press out a clear liquid, leaving the sake kasu or sake lees, and then you end up with what we have, which is a pure type of sake, clear, as opposed to something that actually is white or milky looking, which is nigori sake. So as such, you only have a few ingredients, and each one is just as important as the other in terms of building up the brew. So what I was going to talk about was a concept called jizake, and that term refers to the idea that sake can have a terroir, just like wine does, so that where the brewer is based and the types of ingredients that he is getting locally are just as important to understanding the sake as anything else, that really gives you the essence of what the brewer intended and their idea of making sake. Per that, I've really enjoyed the sakes that are from the north area, basically from Niigata, from Yamagata, from the northern parts above Tokyo, and also from Hokkaido. I find that you get very Tanbei Katakuchi sake from there, very distinct, dry, crisp sake that pairs very well with food. Now, there's a Toji guild for that area that's called the Nambu Toji. And it basically is a guild of people from these various regions who have the same idea about how sake should be produced. And those guilds were exceptionally important in the history of sake. They basically propagated sake around the country, whereas originally you might only know the sake from your region, from your town. This allowed people to exchange ideas, to taste sake from other areas, and that led eventually to more sake being distributed across the country. And sake really had a, I guess, renaissance, you might say, after the war. Now, many sake breweries, unfortunately, closed because of the war, either financially, or in some cases, as I'll speak to later, some actually lost their property, either because of bombings or other problems. So you had a very big reduction in sake breweries from the late 40s until the 60s. But in the 60s, you had a real burgeoning of sake again, because the country started to become a little bit wealthy. People were able to spend more money on luxuries, and as a result, ginjo sake really took off in the 60s. The idea that you could have a premium drink that's Japanese, so you have the cultural pride of our own liquor based in rice culture. And there really was an incredible renaissance for the industry as a whole in the 60s. Unfortunately, that started to dwindle by the 80s. We only had around 3,000 breweries at the start of the 1980s. By the time that the 2000s started approaching, we were down to around 1,400 breweries. And that number has dwindled to around 950 now as a result of the tsunami, now COVID, and other things that have really taken a toll on this industry. You know, the problem for the industry really is it's a very mom and pop industry in a lot of cases. A brewery may have been handed down through multiple generations and it stayed in the same family. And you might get to that family member that doesn't want to take over the brewery because they've seen how much their parents have struggled in what is a very low margin industry. So we've had many breweries that just die out. I remember one story, these guys said that, well, our father told us on his deathbed, don't take over the brewery. This is what killed me. I don't want to see you guys do the same thing. Once he died, they went to their mother and said, well, we want to take over the brewery because we've been thinking about how we could make it more export driven and really change our fortunes. And that company is called Mise Basho. And they're actually one of the best exporters of sake from Japan. And they really renewed themselves by making a completely modern facility that's one of the best sake brewing facilities in the world, basically. And they actually turned part of the old brewery into a large German dining hall so that they could have larger guests come and see the brewery. They also opened a small inn that people could stay at. So they really tried to make it modern and different, and follow some of the things that they have in Napa Valley to attract people to sake culture in the same way that different wine regions around the world, including Napa Valley, attract people to their area from a tourist standpoint to not only enjoy the product, but also enjoy the terroir and the environment around it. So I suggest everyone add a premium sake to their day-to-day drinking or weekly drinking, or whenever you go to a restaurant, please order sake and consider that instead of wine, because you're helping a family somewhere in Japan, and it means a lot. So kanpai to that. But next I want to talk about food. And unfortunately, I can't share my food with you through the screen, but the first pairing that's kind of the classic pairing of Japanese sake is sake with sashimi or sushi. But as I've always liked to say, Japanese people eat more than just sashimi and sushi, but more often than not, this is a really great marriage of food with sake. The sake that I listed here was called Kikusui Junmai Ginjo. That's one that's from Niigata-ken. It means chrysanthemum water. Fabulous, crisp, clean sake that works exceptionally well with any type of fish. But another sake that I like, as I said, is the Dasai Gojuban. And the reason why I point out Dasai is that I actually saw a chef from an episode of the US program Top Chef pair Dasai with one of his dishes in the final round of that particular episode's competition. And he was an LA chef, kind of a California cuisine avant-garde chef, but he spoke to the fact that he found sake to be a much more versatile pairing with dishes than red wine, particularly if you're serving a light fish dish that may not be raw, but is very delicate and really requires a deft touch in terms of pairing. And per that, he also said that more often than not, the problem with pairing with a California Chardonnay as opposed to pairing with sake is that California Chards have become too oaky, too heavy, and they would overpower the food dishes, whereas he could find a light complement like Dasai Gojuban that would pair very well with his food. So again, it sort of depends a little bit on your taste. You might want to go through a few different sakes to find something that works well with your particular taste buds and type of cuisine that you like to make. But I find a Junmai Ginjo, particularly those from the northern regions, from Niigata, Yamagata, the area just above Tokyo as well, you're going to find more Tande Katakuchi sakes that work with virtually everything. So anyone have any questions at all at this point? Okay. Well, moving right along, another myth that I like to break and that I just mentioned is the idea that sake is meant to be had with sushi, and that's our next slide. When we started our first izakaya, which was called Sozai Restaurant and Sake Lounge, it was out in the avenues of San Francisco. And I was the server as well as the co-owner. And I remember the first week of service, there was a young lady who kept trying to get my attention after she had been there about 20 minutes and hadn't ordered anything. So I came by and I was kind of quizzical, and I said, "Oh, yes, ma'am, how can I help you?" And she said, "Excuse me, sir, but do you guys have any real Japanese food, you know, like California rolls?" And I almost had a heart attack. I didn't know what to say. Like, I know that of the 110 million people there, I think they eat more than just raw fish. I think I've had my fair share of pork while I was there, and some other things. But let me check with the chef. Give me a second. So it's just a joke. But unfortunately, in American society, their idea of Japanese food for a long time was limited either to benihana or sushi. And that really limited the idea of what sake in their mind meant. For a lot of people, sake meant we're having sushi. But I'd like to say that this beautiful New York strip that I made another day, barbecued with a little bacon wrapped peach on the side for some extra flavor, is going to go very well with a hearty sake. And that's something that we always had to break myths of in our restaurant, was the idea, even for food critics that would come to our restaurant, or wine professionals, I would have to really try to stress to them the idea that, no, I don't have to serve everything with a Riesling or with a Chardonnay because you're a wine drinker and you don't know what you can drink when you come to my restaurant. We had over 100 bottle sake list that I curated over the course of about 7 to 8 months, finding those bottles that I felt really exemplified different regions and different tastes or styles, and also that went very well with the cuisine that our chefs were making. So I found in my travels and my experience that the regionality in cuisine throughout Japan influenced the type of sake that came from those regions. I thought Yamagata's cuisine, particularly the noodles, the soba, and the udon, were extremely delicate and well produced, and they just went perfectly well with the jizakes from that region, particularly those from Take no Tsuyu Brewery and from Deiwatsuru Brewery. So I found that izakaya really expanded the popularity of more unique food in Japan, and I really wanted to bring that to the US along with my partner. So that's what we did in opening both Sozai and Nombe, and we hope that it helped to drive the idea that it doesn't have to be raw fish that you have when you have the sake, and that doesn't need to be the association in your head. Sake is something that can work with virtually any food, and in a lot of circumstances, it may work a lot better than wine when you're looking at something that improves the food in a sense. I always find in food pairing that I want both the drink as well as the food to be amplified by each other, to interact with each other in a sort of umami where it makes the most mental sense for the two to come together and not for them to be served separately. So that's how you should kind of think about sake. Find those flavors and those styles that really make sense to you. And in my sense, a nice, as I say in the next pairing, a nice Junmai Daiginjo can be the perfect complement to that gigantic fat steak that I had. One that I particularly like, and if you can find it, I would highly encourage you to try this. This is called Tama No Hikari. I think I mentioned the brewery a little earlier. These guys originally started in southern Japan, like northern part of Kyushu, Unfortunately, their original brewery was bombed at the later part of the war in 1944. So by 1947, they had reestablished themselves in Kyoto, and they have a beautiful, small, old brewery in the middle of town, right near the main train station. And they really got huge in the 60s in the Ginjo movement. They went from only being available primarily in like Kobe, Osaka, Kyoto area to being well regarded and available nationally. And they actually ended up establishing 2 izakaya in Tokyo, one of which they started in Tokyo Station back in the 70s. So very well known around the Tokyo region. And before I get to my next slide, I'll tell you a little something about being at that izakaya. But all these terms, you know, most people know them, but for some of our friends who don't, Junmai really relates to, and Junmai Daiginjo and Junmai Ginjo, they relate to the level of milling that's been done to the rice before it was used to make the sake brew before the fermentation began. So typically, a rice kernel is reduced down by at least 50% before it's made into sake. That's usually for futsushu. If you reach the Junmai designation, at least 50% has to have been milled, and it's measured. To meet the Ginjo designation, at least 60%, and then to meet the Daiginjo classification, at least 70%. And these are all measured by the local brewing association officials, and there's one in every prefecture in Japan. A lot of people ask, do big sake makers have a problem making good sake? No, I've had some amazing sakes from Hakutsuru. I've had some very unique locally made sakes here in Northern California made by Shochiku, by using water from the Sierras and using local California rice. So it doesn't mean that a big maker can't make good sake. It just means a lot of times you're going to find a lot more passion from your smaller makers that have had this in their family for generations. So I tend to like smaller sakes that show a bit more terroir than others. And again, I just spoke about this because when you are a restaurateur and you have people come in and they order meats, particularly red meats, their first call is going to typically be, get me a big red wine, more often than not a Cabernet. And I like to tell people, you know, you can take the cab if you want, but it's not necessarily going to get you there. A lot of times Cabernets can be very big, almost overpowering any foods. They can have really high levels of tannins that even your most sophisticated wine drinkers can find off-putting, and so they'll either say that the wine needs to sit for a while and air out, etc., or they might just reject it. I've never had a sake rejected when the goal that I've tried to reach is finding something that cuts the fat out of the food that I'm pairing it with. So those are the only time I go by these numerical values like Nihon Shudo, which talks about the dryness of the sake and the amount of moisture that's within it, or the acidity range. The acidity range is actually very good. Most sakes average right in the middle, about 1.3 on the acidity pH scale from 0.7 to 2. As you get higher acidity, you're going to get more alcohol-driven brews. By what I say is the taste is going to be a little bit more stringent, and that's wherein some people will get, you know, put off by sake because it's so dry and it's so very kind of almost medicinal smelling that it'll be off-putting and they won't enjoy it. So you kind of have to be careful with acidity, but again, I tell people learn the numbers and then forget them. Your senses, your nose, your mouth, your lower palate, your soft palate, those are going to be the things that really determine which sake works for you as opposed to just the numbers. I remember a guy came into my restaurant one time and he loudly pronounced to the entire restaurant, "I only drink the finest things. Bring me a Dai Ginjo sake." And I said, "Sir, can you please spell Evian backwards, and I'll bring that right to you." And Evian backwards spells naive. And my attitude was, "Sir, I could sell you Dom Perignon, but there are so many champagnes that are so much better than Dom Perignon. Why just stick with the brand that you know? Expand yourself and try something different. And don't just go for what seems to be great, because you might be paying more money for something that may not be as good as something that seemingly on packaging is not as appealing." And I point that out with this. This is a cup sake from Chiyomusubi Brewery in Totori. This is called, the actual sake that it's in there is Goriki, but from a branding perspective, in this one cup, they call it Oyaji Gokuraku. The actual sake in it is Goriki, and I have tasted multiple winemakers and wine sommeliers on this sake in particular. And the general response I've gotten every time, especially from these guys with a Burgundy fixation, is that they will say, "This is the Montrachet of sakes. This is the best sake I've ever had." And this is just a junmai. It's just very small production. In Totori, they're renowned sake drinkers. They have a festival every year where most of the festival goers are drinking like an Isho bean on their own and still able to walk and function and talk. I don't get it. God bless those people. But this is, I think, the Montrachet from the standpoint of a day-to-day sake that if you're a white wine drinker, particularly a Sauvignon Blanc drinker, this has very similar tastings and shadings to a very dry, very approachable Sauvignon Blanc. So for those types of wine drinkers, this has always been my go-to, and this is what they love. I could bring them, you know, a 10-year aged sake that costs $250 a bottle, but they would want this because this, for their sensibility and for their palate as wine drinkers and wine producers, was the most approachable sake that they had ever had. And I use this constantly in taste testing. So if you're ever at any, you usually find this at most Japanese grocery stores. You can even find it at a lot of Asian grocery stores like 99 Ranch. Very good go-to sake for day-to-day drinking. And, you know, the packaging doesn't seem to suggest much, but it's great. But I mentioned Tama No Hikari, and I just mentioned it before I get to the last thing I want to mention. And that's sake myth 3 is that there's only 2 types of sake, unfiltered and regular. Recently, nigori has become a big fad, particularly here in America. Nigori, I like to call the white milkshake of sake. It's very sweet. I find it to be a little cloying. It's not something that you can really pair with food, but it serves its purpose, which is to try to get people who are not going to like very dry alcohol to have an interest in sake. And it reminds me of a story about this brewery, Tama No Hikari. So on one of my exploits, I was meeting one of the representatives of the brewery at the izakaya in Tokyo Station. And over the course of about a half hour, we drank a bottle and a half of sake and we're sort of chatting about the state of the industry. And at one point when we were both a little bit drunk, he just stopped talking and he was looking around the room and he said, "Guido-san, this is why sake is dying." And I said, "I don't understand. What do you mean?" He said, "There are no women here. And you're the youngest person here. And that means that the youngest person at this bar is 40. This is why sake is having a tough time surviving, Guido-san." And it was kind of funny, but it was kind of true. I found in my time in Japan that a lot of people saw sake, at least among younger people than I, as the old man's drink. It's not something that they really aspired to have when they went out drinking. More often than not, people were having chuhais and beer, and someone would buy a bottle of shochu and, you know, they'd get a thing of ice to go with it, and everyone's playing around with different flavors to add in. But Nigori was kind of this go-to for some breweries to try to make something they thought would connect more with younger people, and maybe in some cases, and I thought it was sexist to say it, connect with women because it's sweeter. And that's the reason why you've had other styles promulgate. Now, some of these here are just more about people who like to drink. A honjozo is a type of sake where a little brewer's alcohol has been added to it in the brewing process. So it spikes the ABV, the alcohol level, up to about 18, 19% on average, whereas most sakes are usually in the like 13 to 15% range, just like most wines are. So sometimes if you know, a person's thinking, I want a heavier sort of drink and sake is only like here, and I'm thinking more like you know, a hardcore beverage, like a cocktail beverage, they might go for a honjozo. Kimoto and Yamahai are kind of funny. Kimoto is not really a style. It's the way that sake had always been produced. If you've seen any of those old historical ukiyo-e of men with in seemingly like robes or hakata, and they've got long poles and they're jamming them into an open vat. That's called yama orosu, or your yama. You're basically stirring and breaking down the rice so that you're aiding into the fermentation. You're also stirring so that by that process, the lactic acid is more evenly spread throughout the brew so that you get more of a creamy taste to Kimoto sakes that is not necessarily there in other types of sakes. Well, in 1911, a professor from one of the agricultural universities said, "Yama orosu, stop the pole ramming. That's too much labor. If you just wait 2 to 4 weeks more and just let the sake sit, you're going to get that same type of sort of mellowing of the sake and the spreading of that acid throughout the whole vat." So that's why you see Yamahais. Brewers have to take a little extra time to brew them, so their costs go up. But in the ending result, you have a very rich sake that I find a lot of red wine drinkers in particular like. Lastly, there's shizuku, and I bring up shizuku just to talk about the expense that sake makers go through and why it's such a low margin business. So with the rice, again, your sake rice is typically about 2 times more expensive than your best table rice. So you're already starting with a high cost ingredient. And now we're telling you, you've got to start ripping a lot of that down so that you're getting close to the shinpaku, so that we can give you a higher designation above, you know, junmai or a junmai ginjo or to a junmai daiginjo. So expensive ingredients that you need a lot of because you're going to be reducing it and like refining it. And now you have to press out in order to get the pure ingredients. So you have to buy a big expensive press that costs tens of thousands of dollars. And you still haven't even gotten to the process of having a finished product. So the whole process of making sake is expensive. And now, if you want to be exceptional in it, let's add on the shizuku style of pressing. Now this is simply taking mesh bags that will hold the sake kasu back and suspending them from poles inside the sake vat. So I remember visiting Yuki Nobosha brewery, and they had been making their presentation sake or their championship sake for the Hiroshima Sake Championships. And in one particular vat, there were about 40 bags being suspended by poles, and sake is slowly dripping out of the bags. And he told me this process was going to take about 5 weeks to do. So they were timing it to make sure that they could press and be ready for the championship on the exact day when they would be traveling down to Hiroshima to do so. So just think about the cost of labor of setting all these things up in your brewery and suspending production operations so you could get to this part of producing the final sake for just one style, the Shizuku style that you're going to have in the championship, and then maybe only make about 200 or 300 bottles of. So really, really high cost to doing very unique things. And that's why people will come up with new types of sakes, and why we have this myth that I'd like to break by our last pairing, which is with this. I am not necessarily someone that loves sparkling sake, but being a restaurateur, being a sake sommelier, and trying best to make a full experience for people, some people like to have a dessert wine. Some people like to have something, even like an aperitif to start their meal with. So a lot of these things. Oh, thank you, Mari-san. We'll see you again soon. Basically, I started promoting sparkling as a way to get my diners to order dessert and order more sake. And I found a lot of the sparklings that I first was trying and tasting, they were no different than the malt liquor kind of drinks that are popular, you know, like Smirnoff Ice or a wine cooler. Basically things that are really brewed in the same way as beer, but brewed to have a higher level of alcohol content in them. And so it just wasn't sake. It wasn't very refreshing. This, however, has a little hint of pear and a nice sort of tingling of peach that you feel on the after. And you can actually serve it in a wine glass. And for those of you who are in the industry, you know, a lot of times people in the US at least, they're not really down with the small ochoko. They want stemware. They want to have something in their hand. So I found that by serving it this way, it also changed the people's perception. They almost thought of it as like getting wine. And if I gave them a pour similar to the amount they'd see in a wine glass when it's presented to them, it broke down a little bit of their apprehension. And it's a small thing, but little things will actually make the whole process of enjoying sake a little different. You know, I'm not a big warming sake person, but sometimes people want to have what they're used to. So to do it right, I suggest people not to put the sake directly in a pot on the stove, put it in something else so that you're double boiling it. And also have the thermometer with you. I typically do not like super warm sake, so I'll serve mine Nudukan, which is about 47, I believe. Keep your thermometer with you. That way you're going to end up with proper warm sake. More often than not, that thing that's the warmer at the sushi bar, I say it's like taking a nice reserve Chardonnay, throwing it in the microwave and nuking it for 2 minutes and then serving it. You're completely destroying what the brewer intends when you do that. So warm your sake appropriately if you're going to do it, but I suggest don't do it at all because cold sake is the way to go. Also, in terms of homo chocos, if you're really into sake tasting, this is the tasting choco that we use in competitions when we're judging, and also when you're doing blind tasting. And you see this kind of like bullseye pattern in blue at the bottom of the cup. That's so that when evaluating sake, you can get more of a sense of the clarity of it, because you have a contrast at the bottom that you don't necessarily get if it's all white. These are available in J-Town. You can probably also get them from most, you definitely get it from my buddy Bo over at True Sake here. I know there's a couple great sake shops in Manhattan, and there's also a couple good ones in Chicago. If you want to know more about those, you probably have to check with me on the side because I have to look at some back notes. And also in terms of ochoko, you can play around with things. I love these types that you can have inside the hako, the little box, so that you can serve sake overflowing so that they can start here and then finish with the box. Again, it seems like I just have a lot of toys, but some of the toys are fun, and it actually makes more interest, I think, for people when it comes to sake. Another thing you may have heard of is kadu sake, which is basically sake that's through a cedar some people actually bottle it with a cedar taste already because they've put it in cedar at their brewery and stored it for a while to impart the smell of the wood and the flavor almost of the wood. But you can do it with a small box like this, which I got in Kamiyacho a few years ago. I think this was like 3,000 yen or something. You put your sake in here, even I would pour the dasai in here, leave it for about 5 minutes or so, and you're gonna have a beautiful cedar flavor and smell that's really refreshing, whether it's cold or it's warm. So I came to love sake because of my father-in-law. Always had great times when I'd get there and I'd be kicked out of the kitchen because the only job I had was to set the table. So Dad would put a bottle on the table, usually of Suige, which was his favorite. And I always like to say the first question was, Giru-san, does Barry Bonds do drugs? And I'm like, yes, Dad, I'm sure that he does drugs, and I don't care because we haven't won the World Series yet, so we need to do what we can. But I miss those times because he and I bonded over sake, and I think it's a great drink to share with people, and that's what I've loved doing for the past 10 years. So thank you all. That logo top left there is the company I started with our colleague there, Mari, who is battling the streets of Yokohama and the underground right now. We started this restaurant back in 2010, and we were named Top 100 SF Chronicle Restaurant. We also were rated Top 6 izakaya in the country by Bon Appetit magazine in 2011. But we actually started, while I was getting this presentation together, I saw a logo for my old company, and actually it might have been on some things that Stuart did for us back in the day in terms of our photography and our advertising. But we started with Sozai with the idea that we wanted people to enjoy and taste the essence of ingredients. And that's been sort of a hallmark of our food since the start. We created something called the ramen burger. If you haven't heard of that in Japan, it's a US trendy food. But we basically make buns out of ramen noodles, and then our take on it was to serve our pork belly ground with Wagyu beef, and it's become a really big seller for us. We've been one of the leading vendors at the largest concert venue in the US. It's called Outside Lands, which we have here in San Francisco every year. Unfortunately, because of COVID, it's not happening this year. In fact, I wouldn't be doing this presentation because this was supposed to be the first day of Outside Lands. So COVID's really had a challenge on our operations. We do cooking classes and corporate team building. We also do full Japanese and fusion catering. A lot of those activities were actually 100% stopped on March 16th here in San Francisco because we had the first major shelter-in-place order in the United States. So I started a ramen bento kit service here locally so that we could just keep cooking and keep alive and tell people we're coming back. And it was kind of nice. Since that time, we've started to cook for some of the elderly people here in San Francisco through a program called Great Plates Delivered in conjunction with Off the Grid. So COVID's had a challenge on us, as I'm sure on everyone, but we hope you all wear masks and stay safe and alive, and hopefully we come out of this even stronger and better as people next year. Thank you very much.